of Communication 250. Today we are starting with wait, what is a podcast? If you're curious about links to some of the items I mentioned during the lecture, please review those links in the slideshow speaker notes. So, what is a podcast? Well, a podcast, the word is actually derived from a combination of the words iPod and broadcast. And as much as that made everyone who owned a Zune hate it, podcast is generally the term we use nowadays for these types of recordings. And the what we're talking about here is a format that is on demand. So remember that whenever you are recording and you're developing your programs, that these are on demand items. So your audience isn't obligated to see it. They're quite possibly unaware of it unless they are going out and seeking your program. So again, not only is it on demand, it's also an on the go medium. People can download or stream them nowadays. And nowadays, there are also options where you have things like on YouTube where they'll have channels that are audio video podcasts. So if your podcast seems like something where a video version might be a good idea, then keep that going on the back burner and think about it whenever you're in the development stage. And often, whenever we are looking at podcasts, they are usually stored on a specific server somewhere, possibly on the podcast website originally, and then it's distributed to different platforms like Spotify or Apple, and people can either download or stream them from there. Another way they can be delivered is through RSS. Now, if you remember from Communication 212, that's really simple syndication, or if you've seen it elsewhere before, the little RSS symbol is going to look like a little dot with two curved lines coming off of it, kind of like sound waves. So, RSS, or really simple syndication, is the main way that podcasts are distributed. Now, a few quick statistics for you about podcasts. So, Americans' interest in podcasts has been growing. So, back when they first started, very few people knew about them. 2013, even only 7% of Americans 12 and up listened to a podcast per week. And in 2023, so the most recent data shows that people have increased their listening to 31% per week. So 31% of people 12 and up have said that they listen to a podcast each week. And the average podcast, whenever we're talking about how many people are listening to it, it actually only has about 27 listens per episode. And this is an average, people. It isn't just like how many you should expect or something. The We're including numbers like the 3,200 listens per podcast episode that you'll find in the top 1% in there, as well as several of them where they have, 0 to 2 listens per week or per podcast episode. And according to the website Listen Notes, more than 3 million podcasts exist right now in January 2025. So that is a huge number, and people just keep making them. And their list even excludes some of the ones that are, someone created 3 or 4 episodes and then they abandoned it type of podcast. So if you include those, then we get it like I think they said it was close to 5 million or something if you include abandoned websites. But generally speaking, the number of active podcasts going on, it's about 3.4 million. So, again, the biggest thing you should take from that is your audience chooses your podcast. So, you want to make it something that they want to choose, something that they will actively seek out. Otherwise, you might get lost in the noise. So, let's figure out why your audience would choose you. Now, podcasts are definitely a niche medium. That means that we are looking at an audience who is specifically looking for a particular style or maybe a particular topic. There are, of course, an infinite number of topics available. So you want to use audience segmentation to help you figure out who your audience is. Now, if you remember, audience segmentation includes main areas like demographics, geographics, psychographics, and behaviors. One more time, that was demographics, geographics, psychographics, and behaviors. And those are the things that you'll look at to help you kind of imagine who your target audience will be. Now, whenever you are developing your podcast, remember that you need to hook listeners in the first few seconds. People tune out within the first 15 seconds of a podcast most of the time. So they know right away whether or not it's working for them and they move on to the next one. Because, hey, with over 3 million podcasts, they have plenty to choose from. And part of why it's so important to think about your target audience is because podcasts are personal. Podcasts are something that someone is not only choosing to listen to, but you're also talking directly to them through this medium. So you want to make sure that people feel comfortable with you and that they feel like you have something important or useful to say. Now, whenever you're making those audience connections, you even want to include anecdotes that your audience can connect with. So instead of, for example, like in your book, they were talking about the show Pop Culture Happy Hour. Well, on its surface, it's a group of people who are sitting around talking about movies and entertainment and whatnot that they enjoy. And they have a segment called What's Making Us Happy each week. And so they talk about whatever their current favorite pick is. Well, believe it or not, they don't really necessarily give what their true favorite pick is for that item. They aren't going to include something that they think that almost no one has ever heard of. They want to include something that is at least slightly, that their audience would be slightly aware of, and that they would be able to look up easily and get to know a little more about it. So even if it isn't necessarily a completely obvious item, it is still something that their audience is able to look at and find and connect with fairly quickly, or it's something that they've maybe that their audience has heard of in passing somewhere else. And of course, whenever you're making these kinds of intimate connections with your audience, no matter what kind of show you have, you can still leave room for experimentation. And of course, there can be trends that are relevant to your show, and those can influence what types of topics you tackle every week. Now, take a second and think about what is your dream podcast? What do you want to do with podcasting that you couldn't do with something else? Right, let's move on to podcast development. So, podcast development, whenever we're talking about podcasting, this is more than something that's a like a one-to-many model like we have with broadcasting, traditional broadcasting, or even newspapers where you have one group who's writing a bunch of things and then just sending it out to people and not necessarily taking in as much information from their audience. Instead, with podcasts, even though you are technically a person or a group developing these podcasts and sending them out to however many people to be streamed or downloaded, uh, instead, you need to remember that your audience will be interacting with you somewhat because they are choosing your podcast. And also because sometimes they'll have things that they want to tell you. They might send you fan mail, or they might message you on your social media platform or wherever you have your messaging set up. And so it isn't just about what you want to say in the podcast, it's about what others want to hear. So when you're developing your podcast, remember that you have to think about what others want to hear too. They don't want to just hear you sitting and giggling with your friends. They want to hear something that relates to them in a more personal way. So find something interesting with an audience to hear it. Which means that we need to find out who your target audience is. So, who is your target audience? Now, here's our first exercise called Know Thy Listener. And so, whenever we're looking at this, you want to find this will help you to find a target audience. Now, you'll notice these questions relate to again, things like geographics, demographics, psychographics, that kind of stuff. So, is your audience local, national, international, or maybe a blend of different groups? Like maybe it's a more, you have primarily people in Louisiana, but you do also have some other listeners in the US. Or maybe you have some international listeners, and so you want to make sure that you're covering topics that are relevant to both your international followers as well as your national followers. And not just where are these people located, but we also want to ask, where is your audience? What are they doing whenever they're listening to you? Are they walking around? Are they driving? Are they riding the bus to school? What's going on in their lives? And how can you uh, help them improve their lives, or at least entertain them for a few minutes, right? You also want to think about, how is your audience feeling? Are they the type of people who might have just listened to an hour of serious news and maybe they want something a little less serious to think about for a minute? Are they the type of people who enjoy listening to long form journalism where they want to go really in depth in whatever the current topic is in this news cycle? Like, what is it that they're seeking? And then also, what are you offering in return for your audience's time? This can be something that's just purely entertainment. It doesn't have to be something really serious. But if it is, again, you want to, whatever it is that you're doing, you want to make sure that it's worth your audience's time, that they're being entertained, that they're being informed, whatever it is that your goal is with your podcast. All right. And now that we've answered those questions, let's figure out how to develop our target audience, our possible target audience people. So, based on the answers to that last exercise, Know Thy Listener, write a list of people who might be interested in your podcast. All right. You have your list? Great. Let's move on and select the people who are most likely to listen as the middle of your target. So that means think of the people that you're aiming for the most as your like weekly or every episode type of listeners, the ones who can't wait to see you drop another one and they want to find out what it is you're covering this week. And choose people who are likely to listen to most of your episodes in the next ring, and then people who are interested in some of your episodes for the one following. So that means that we're starting with the center where we have all of our like everyday listeners, and then maybe or every episode, excuse me, every episode listeners, and then we're working our way out with people who listen more often or maybe slightly less often. Now, here's an example of a target where the innermost ring is your main audience. So, this is the same one you can find in your textbook. If you look, they were talking about some kind of craft brew show. And of course, who's in the middle of their ring? Well, that means people who are home brewers, craft beer drinkers, and pub crawlers. So, people who would be really interested in these kinds of craft brew type things. Um, People who might be in the next ring, interested in most of what you have to say, but not necessarily everything. Maybe they'll skip one or two episodes. People like foodies, people who are kind of party animal people or happy hour people, college students, spring break revelers, and then they work their way out to people who might tune in once in a while, like bar owners or restaurant people and hospitality groups. And then our outermost ring are people who maybe want to organize tours. So if you have some episodes where you talk about home brewing or craft brews in particular parts of the country, then maybe some of these tourist people would want to find out about it. Or if you cover some of the different things that people want to learn, like commercial makers, maybe you want to help them learn how to advertise or market themselves to other areas, then you could have those kinds of episodes and they might listen in once in a while. But whatever it is, remember you're mainly focusing on your the middle of your target. So thinking about topics related to these people, the home brewers, craft beer drinker, pub crawler people, and then of course our secondary inner group of the foodies and party people. So now we want to review our topics. Do you have any information or ideas of value to all of these people? So think about things that would make uh, all of these different example listeners excited, and some things that would make the each couple of rings excited as well. You can break it down a little bit, but mostly you want to figure out what kind of overlapping information would work together with it. And do you feel excited about creating shows for these people and answering their comments and questions? Remember, people love to comment about things and ask questions. So if you feel, kind of annoyed already thinking about answering questions for some of these people, then maybe you want to rethink how you're developing your podcast. Now, if you're having trouble with your rings and figuring out who belongs where, you could have an idea that is either too broad or not broad enough. So, this means that you need to specialize or broaden your concept. Let's look at specializing your podcast. So ask the following: what specific aspects of this topic will you be covering? Um, and of course, this is assuming that you're having the problem of your topic being too broad. We'll go over the other one in just a moment. But if you're trying to specialize your podcast a bit more, which specific parts of your topic will you be covering? What will you say about this topic that hasn't already been said? Listen to some of the other podcasts about this, or look at some of the blog posts that people have made, that people in your rings, in your target audience, might already listen to. And then think about how can you deliver the information in a unique or a counterintuitive way, so maybe an unexpected way compared to what's already out there. Now, conversely, if you are too specific about what you're doing, like if you are only talking about a special kind of chair from the 18th century, then that is going to be way too specific and you'll barely have enough for one episode. So you want to ask the following to help you make it a little broader, make your podcast a little easier for you to produce more episodes and also for you to get a slightly larger audience. So what additional angles could you cover to make it more appealing? Um, Again, if you're talking about like 18th century furniture, maybe you'll just go into antiques in general. If you're talking about sports, maybe instead of just covering one particular sport at a school, you might cover all of the sports that they have at the school. And then whenever you think about these additional angles, write them down, brainstorm them, and then see, does this idea have enough scope to keep an audience interested over multiple episodes? So are you widening it enough to keep your intended audience interested, or did you accidentally go overboard? Or are you still too narrow in your thought process? Now, it's time to do a little research. So, look for one podcast related to your ideal topic and see what they're doing. And based on what they're doing, think about how yours will be different. What are you going to do that's different from what they're already doing? What are you adding to the conversation here? Now, one of the things your audience will ask is, what's in it for me? So you want to think about how you are addressing your audience's needs. Now, again, this doesn't have to be a serious type of thing. It could just be that you are helping them figure out which new movie to go watch, or maybe you enjoy reviewing books and you want to talk about all the ones in a new genre a new in a new year and say like, oh yeah, the ones in this by these romance authors are great, or the ones by this sci-fi person are super. So think about some common problems your audience might have, and that can help you come up with episodes and needs that you're meeting for them. um, Help meet their general needs. Another NPR show called Life Kit, the title explains it all. They address everyday issues that people generally have at one point or another in their lives. And so they are meeting a need that their audience has. Also, you could do things like clarifying confusing topical issues, whether it's something in technology, politics, in other arenas, like maybe you want to talk about climate change and interview a bunch of different professionals about it. You could do something like that, whatever it is. Or like I even saw one about whether or not you should write thank you cards or how to write thank you cards for your whenever you have to write thank you cards for something, um, which is kind of a combination of clarification and meeting a need. So you also want to do things like help meet or develop dreams. Maybe you want to talk about how to develop a small business, or you want to help people learn how to garden or learn how to knit, or you want to teach them how to throw an American football. Whatever it is, find something that people might want to learn how to do. And also focus on what people love. Find things that people in your target audience might enjoy and talk about those things. And also, whenever you're going through, remember you aren't just rehashing what other people already have. If you do that, then what's the point of having your show? Instead, you want to answer unasked questions, or answer some questions that people have asked, and maybe they don't really have a very well-defined answer yet. So, whatever it is, you want to find a way to address these problems for your audience and help them understand and, improve their lives a little bit. So, in order to help your audience, of course, you need to know a little bit about them. And in addition to thinking about like where do they live geographically, as in like in the US, in Louisiana, wherever, think about where do they live? Are they living in suburbs? Are they living in the city? Um, are they maybe attending different types of events, like especially when we talk about entertainment types of things? Are they people who enjoy going to conventions? Or if we're talking like the music industry, they have a lot of different professional events for people depending on which part of the music industry you're in. So maybe it's someone who is interested in those types of things. So you want to look at related products or maybe related events and use those to help you develop episodes. Um, Look at different magazines, newspapers, other media. See what else interests them. What other websites do they read or visit? What social media do they use the most? That will also help you when we get into the part about marketing your podcast so you can figure out how to best reach them. And what platforms do they use to stream or download content? That's another one. It's important to be available on the platform where your audience is most likely to show up. And of course, you can use an RSS to send it out to lots of different places, or people can subscribe directly. So we have a lot of flexibility when it comes to podcasts. So after you review some of those things, like the books and stuff, or different locations where your audience might go, whether it's related to your podcast or maybe in general, like where are they going? Are they going on Instagram? Are they going on TikTok while it's still here? Um, are they going to conventions? Then you want to answer these questions. What tone does this audience find appealing? Are they looking at something more serious, or do they like that kind of lighthearted, off the cuff type of style? What length does this audience find appealing? You don't want to make an hour-long video for people who are looking for something that's 5 minutes. So make sure that you're appealing to them in the appropriate time frame, and look at what engages them most based on most read or liked posts, greatest downloads, those kinds of things. So, whenever you're looking on social media or looking at website posts, those kinds of things, see which ones are getting the most engagement. And that can help you to decide what types of topics to cover, Same thing when you're looking at formatting too. It could be that ones that are a particular format are going to be more appealing, and you want to pay attention to those kinds of details. Now, in addition to your audience's needs, you also need to keep in mind your own needs. What are things that you have available? Well, the three big ones are time, money, and passion. Again, that is time, money, and passion. If you are short on any of these, then you need to find a way to make up for it. Now, of course, the passion one is the hardest one uh, to make up. So you really do want to focus on a topic that you love. It has to be something where you're you're always telling other people about it. You make them sit down and listen to you, even when you can tell that they really don't want to, but they're your friends, so they're going to. Um, and then you can figure out how to work with a lower budget or maybe a little less time than you would like. Um, so, again, the one that you need the most is going to be passion for your topic and for developing your podcast. Now, there are lots of different types of podcasts, but in general, we can group them into four categories. The first one, interview shows. These are the ones that tend to be chart toppers, things like the Joe Rogan Experience, Hot Ones, pretty much the majority of sports shows that are not roundtables are going to be interview shows. Um, Now, the roundtable or panel is our next one, and that's when you have usually one or two hosts, and those people are going to discuss a topic, and often they will include interviews, but they don't necessarily. Um, so it's something that is set up a little differently from the strictly interview format. Now, performance programs, this is where we're looking at deep diving into a particular type of media. So things like Talking Sopranos would be one. They have things like Pop Culture Happy Hour, which are kind of straddling the round table and performance styles. Um, but in general, performance programs are going to be a little more of how did this get made, Talking Sopranos, going behind the scenes and really diving into a particular musician or a particular TV show or movie or something. And then we also have narrative fiction and nonfiction. Now, these can be shorter form, but a lot of the best ones are going to be the ones that are 30 minutes to an hour in size. They also require a lot of work going into them. So let's look at each of these in a little more detail, see what you're getting into. Now, before we go into the interview style, a few general must-haves whenever you are developing a podcast. You do need to research your topic and you need to take notes. So, whatever it is that you're doing, even if you're writing a fiction script, you still need to have some research and development that happens on before we start getting into writing a full script. Now, the majority of podcast styles, you don't necessarily need or even want sometimes a full script. A lot of times, a few basic notes to keep you on task are perfect. And then you write an intro and an outro for each episode, and you're good. But whatever style you choose or a combination of styles, you want to have a clear path and focus from beginning to end. So you aren't just meandering in the middle where everyone just starts giggling and there's like nothing really happening and everything grinds to a halt. So make sure that you keep that little engine running and you go through the episode with enough momentum to go from beginning to end. All right, so the first type we mentioned is the interview show, and this is where you have one or two hosts and then one or two guests. Or, if you're interviewing a group, maybe four or five guests, like whenever you have a band on a show or something. Um, Now, this type of show requires strong interview skills. Like, you need to be very comfortable talking to people, interviewing them, getting all this information from them. And it's so that's definitely something to keep in mind when you are deciding what kind of podcast you want. If you're going for an interview style, be someone who's comfortable talking to people, asking them questions, and you know, kind of seeing where your conversation is going and guiding the conversation. Now, believe it or not, the I've watched a few episodes of Hot Ones, and even with all the chicken and the other stuff that he uses to frame his interviews, or maybe because of it, uh, the interviewer for that show it does a really great job. If you want to listen to something that is not one of the NPR recommendations in the book, I would definitely recommend watching a few episodes of Hot Ones. He really goes into detail with his interviewees, and he talks to them about, I mean, he usually does talk about whatever it is that they have going on, if they have a new show, a new song, whatever, but he goes into a lot more detail about their background and about them as a person. So he isn't really just a PR tool for them. He's actually giving a good interview. And of course, you can find good interviewers in lots of different places, but make sure that you, whenever you're conducting an interview, that you do your research and you have a strong handle on how to steer that interview ship. And whenever you are doing these, of course, you will need to go back and listen to it. But the good news is, if you have a good interview, then you don't need to do a lot of editing in post. These are really quick turnarounds. So whenever you're doing it, you go, you interview them, you add a few, your soundtrack behind it, um, and include your intro, outro, and you're done. And you might cut one or two questions in there if they weren't very good, but for the most part, or if you need to cut some stuff for time. But interview shows are going to be one of your fastest to record and edit. Now, our next one is the roundtable or panel. And this is something for people who like to banter a little bit. You like to talk to different people, talk about lots of different topics, and you're okay with people expressing their own opinions that are different from yours, because that's the key to a great roundtable or panel discussion. You don't want a bunch of people just saying, yeah, you're really right about that. And then there's silence and everyone hates it. So make sure whenever you are putting together a roundtable or panel show that you have people with multiple perspectives and that they're able to provide some clear insight into whatever it is you're discussing. And there are tons of different examples of the roundtable or panel. The Pop Culture Happy Hour show is one example. Fandom Entertainment has their own version of it as well, where they'll have kind of a couple of rotating seats, and then the primary host on the show. And this is something, again, where you do need to go into it and make sure that you have a clear agenda of topics to discuss. This isn't something where you just sit around and chit chat with your friends. You need to have a clear start, middle, and end to your program. So you want to, or at least a clear start and end. And you want to have an engaging host who can direct the conversation. So whenever you get sidetracked talking about something dumb someone's dog did, yeah, it's funny and it's something that people will enjoy, but it's also something that you need to break off from and get back on topic, unless your topic for the episode is dumb things dogs do. Now, another great example is the Skiffy and Fanty show. The two co-hosts on here they generally work by themselves. They don't really have people on the show as much, but they do an amazing job of guiding the audience through reviews of different sci-fi and fantasy books and old shows and movies and things. So uh, definitely give it a listen if you want to see a good example of having a roundtable without having as many guests on the show. Another reason you might avoid including too many guests in a roundtable is it can get confusing for your listener if they are listening and they hear your voice, the co-host voice, and then they hear six other voices on there. It's hard to keep track in the audio realm without having those extra faces to put to the sounds. So make sure that you keep that in mind if you decide to have additional people on an episode. And some of the great things about this is if you have someone who can be an engaging host, then it can be a really wonderful and fruitful discussion about different topics. Or also, you can easily expand your episodes. So, in terms of your main idea of what your podcast is going to be, instead of just focusing on one item, you're able to expand and include more things. So, for example, if you're hosting a show about sci-fi movies, well, maybe you decide to start including fantasy movies in there, and then you start including sci-fi and fantasy books. And that way you're expanding your topic, but you're still staying within the core concept of your podcast. Now, performance programs. This is something where you're usually educating your audience a little more. You're making them aware of something. And usually, this something is going to be related to like entertainment or media or something like that. So, we're talking shows like World Cafe, where they always interview different artists, especially newly emerging artists, and they'll talk to them about their process, their new album, whatever it is that they have going on. It could also be shows like The Office Show or like the Office podcasts or Talking Sopranos or any of those ones where the hosts are actually people who are on the show and they're educating people about different episodes or answering different questions the audience might have about it. So there needs to be, whenever you're talking about this type of show, we have one or two hosts. They might include guests, they might not, but there needs to be a clear reason for each episode. So, why are you featuring this particular content on this show? And provide some background about it. Now, the biggest negative for this is going to be that you often need some kind of licensing rights whenever you're talking about reviewing movies and music and things. And most of the time, especially for someone just starting out, this is not going to be in your budget. So it's important if you do these kinds of shows to keep that in mind. And you'll notice that that's probably honestly part of why World Cafe uses so many emerging artists instead of including people who are already famous. Not only do the already famous people not need it, but it's a lot easier to license someone who is probably not under contract, and they're able to tell you, they're a little freer about saying, like, oh, yeah, you can record our performance and totally post it online because it's going to help us so much and it'll help you. And so it helps everybody. Um, and also, the format wise, this is going to include a little less chit chat style, or sometimes a lot less, depending on the host. But it's going to be more of you explaining to your audience what's going on and giving them information versus kind of the chit chat that you have in the round table style. Now, finally, we have the narrative type. Now, the narrative style can be fiction or nonfiction, and this refers to storytelling. And this means that you need, at minimum, a narrator to have the show. If you're looking at something that's based in fiction, then you probably need to audition two or three voice actors to be on the show as well. So keep that in mind whenever you're deciding what type to create. Now, there are lots of different versions of this style. A few of the nonfiction ones include things like Throughline or Decoder Ring, where they're going into a specific topic, but it's talking about things that maybe the audience didn't necessarily, you're answering questions that they may not have known they were asking or that they wanted to ask, or you're addressing a current event through a different perspective, or you're hoping to include multiple journalists interviews in there, and you're going to edit it together with some other information from different sources and create this really elaborate explanation of what's going on with a particular topic. So this one is going to require a lot more background checking, more it takes a little more time to put together, especially for the first episode, because you will need to figure out who your narrator or host is. And again, if you're doing something where you need actors, you need to audition people and those kinds of things. So this is also the one where you want to write a script. This is the main style where a script should be used, because you want to make sure that you include all the information your audience needs. You want to make sure that you're pacing it correctly, and it's going to be edited a lot more than the other styles that we've mentioned. And this means that there's probably also a higher cost of time, production, and money associated with it. Now, it is possible to create a narrative without a lot of money, but you would need to make sure that you have enough time to put into it. And of course, we'll get into this more in just a second, but you can always have other people help you if you need to put in more time than you have available. Maybe you have some, some other people who are willing to donate some of theirs. All right. Now that we looked at the four different types. Which format best fits your podcast vision? The interview show, a roundtable or panel, performance program, or a narrative. And remember, it is possible that it'll be and most likely that there will be a little overlap between one or more of these styles, but in general, these are the four main types: interview, roundtable, performance, and narrative. Now, here are a few concept questions. So, while you're trying to figure out what you're doing, let's talk about, why are you creating a podcast? Why does it need to be a podcast and not another medium? Has anyone already used your concept? Why would someone seek your podcast instead of another one that already exists? And this is where you want to do some research and listen to some of the other podcasts that are out there and think about which audience needs are not being met. And you can also use things like foci. Remember from Communication 212, fame, oddity, conflict, immediacy, and impact. It's important to think of those things whenever you are figuring out how to develop your media message. And so you'll notice that some of those, especially the interview styles, the most famous interview types are going to be ones where they're focusing on famous people, interviews with famous people, which means that whenever you're developing your podcast, that unless you're, best friends with Shaquille O'Neal, maybe you want to look for someone else or some other style to use where you can still address your audience and help them add something to their daily lives. And most important question here, what is the unmet need your podcast meets? Again, what is the unmet need your podcast meets? So think about what your audience needs and what are you helping them to achieve? What are you helping them to learn? What are you helping them to overcome through your use of, hilarious roundtable hijinks? Whatever it is, think about the unmet need that you're meeting with this podcast. And that will go a long way to helping you figure out why you're doing a podcast and how to make yours different from the ones that already exist. Now, how long should it be? So, how long should your episodes be? How many episodes should you have? You want to look at things like the amount of time you have available, your budget, your story complexity. If you're trying to tell a complex story, you can't do it in 3 minutes. So, you want to make sure that you give yourself enough time and also that you give yourself enough time in between episodes to really dig in to your topic if you need to, or at least enough time in between to prepare and take notes and do all of that pre-production that we're talking about. Now, how often should you publish episodes? Well, it really honestly kind of doesn't matter to a certain extent, how often you publish episodes. You can publish episodes once a week, you can publish them once a month or twice a month, whatever. But however often you publish them, you need to be consistent. Consistency is the biggest draw for an audience. They don't want to see one episode in February and then two in March and then none until September. Think about how annoying that would be. So you want to build that audience relationship by publishing consistently and figure out who your host is. You don't necessarily have to be your host. You can be the awesome producer who works behind the scenes, who figures out how everything's going to be put together, and who has someone who is very personable and who has a great ability to connect with audiences, even when people can't see them. And you might want to use them as your host instead. Or and you also want to ask, who is this podcast not for? So consider revising your target audience whenever you need to. This could mean maybe getting rid of a few of those like outer layer people and replacing them with someone else. Or maybe you realized after putting together lists of a few different topics that you want to cover, that it isn't really lining up with your initial vision, and that's okay. But you need to make sure that you are developing everything with consistently, and that you are creating a podcast that people will find engaging. Now, our next exercise, what's your one-liner? Now, this is a big one. If you've ever heard of kind of the elevator pitch, now the one-liner is in that same vein where you are going to describe your podcast in one short, coherent sentence. Yay. So that means not a paragraph-sized sentence. Give me, you know, a brief description of what your podcast is. And consider the tone and the content. Who is it for? Why should people care? You should be answering those questions. Which of those points that we addressed earlier are most important to your audience? What are you addressing? What are you helping them to improve in their life? What are you helping them to overcome? Or are you helping them to get away from, kind of the mundanity of everyday life? Are you helping them to improve themselves? How does this one-liner surprise or make you curious? What are you promising your audience? Whatever it is, you want to be able to explain it in this one sentence. Let's look at a few examples. So this first one is NPR's From the Top showcases the music, stories, and unique humor of America's best young classical musicians. Okay, so right away, we know what it is. It's a show about young classical musicians, and it's showcasing them through their stories. And it says right here in this one line that it's supposed to be a little, fun, uplifting, probably have some silly stories thrown in there. Now, our next one is Welcome to Night Vale. And it says, Welcome to Night Vale provides twice monthly updates for the small desert town of Night Vale, where every conspiracy theory is true. Now, if you hadn't guessed, this is a fiction podcast, and we know how often they update based on this. So, twice monthly updates. And you don't have to commit to this in your one liner. This is just an example of how these people put it together. And it's been around for a while, so they're able to say, like, oh, yeah, we're going to post twice a month. Twice monthly updates for the small desert town of Night Vale. So we know that it's about this fictional town, and it's where every conspiracy theory is true. So we know right away what kind of town Night Vale is and what to expect and when to expect it. Now, this last one is from Decoder Ring. And it says in each episode, host Willa Paskin takes a cultural question, object, or habit, examines its history, and tries to figure out what it means and why it matters. So we can tell this is going to be a show where the host is talking about a wide variety of things, but they are all culturally relevant questions. So things about different cultures, maybe. Um, And she's going into the history of the thing and figuring out how it relates to our current lives. And I have to say, she did one before on Parmesan cheese that was pretty cool. The which I know sounds crazy, but it really was. And lots of other things. She also did the blue dress one, where they talked about the blue dress picture, and several other different things. So lots of different cultural questions. So she can go between items that are trending right now and things that are maybe just general, oh, I never thought to ask, but I'm happy to know the answer type of podcasts. Now, here's another item to help you as you develop your podcast concept. It's a project blueprint. So you would fill in the blanks like project title, which is our first blank, is and second blank is format, that, and third blank key benefit, for, audience, who, and then describe the need or opportunity. So whenever we talk about format in here, it isn't like it's a podcast because we've moved past that by now. We're talking about, is it a narrative? Is it a roundtable? Is it an interview? What kind of podcast are we developing here? And you'll notice that this relates quite a bit to the one-liners that we just heard. And then we have an additional description after it. So part two says, unlike alternatives. So this is after you do some research and you find out what some of the alternative podcasts are. Our project, and then you state your advantage. What is the advantage of your particular podcast? And that's where we are coming up with what makes you different from these other things that already exist. So now that we've talked about content a bit and talking to your audience, let's talk about podcast names. Now, of course, podcast names are like the headline for your podcast. This is the first thing people see. And so you want to find a good one, and you want to find one that is descriptive without already being taken or being maybe a little too weird for people to figure out. So think unique yet accessible. Make people want to learn more, not something where they need to know more information before they know what kind of podcast you have. So brainstorm lots of names, write them down in your notebook or on a note on your phone, and keep updating that list. It might take a little while for you to land on one that you really like. And whenever you get two or three good ones, try searching your top names online. You can check podcast directories and also the US Patent and Trademark Office. Make sure that you aren't overlapping with something. Obviously, if you were to name your podcast something like General Mills or Coca-Cola, there's going to be a problem. So make sure that you are not infringing on someone else's copyright or trademark or anything else, and you should be all right. And try testing some of those names on friends and family and see how they react. And of course, if they say, like, oh, yeah, that's great, that might mean that you need to keep working on it. So keep that little honesty meter in the back of your head. But in general, ask your friends and family, see if it sounds like something they would listen to, even if they aren't necessarily your most target audience people. Now, our next exercise is called Know Thyself. And this is where we need to acknowledge reality. We cannot be like Neo and stop bullets in the Matrix. So that means that we cannot stop time. Time will keep going. And just like time, money can also run out. So we need to make sure that we are budgeting appropriately and acknowledging what actually exists in order to effectively create a podcast and ensure its survival. So, our first part, time, we want to, if we're limited on time, one solution is to publish shorter podcasts less often. Um, or instead, maybe not necessarily shorter, but you could publish them a little less often. So maybe once a month instead of twice a month. And that way you give yourself enough time to do any research or take care of your other job or whatever it is that you have going on. Now, our next step is money. And if you are low on money, then you want to find ways to overcome this. Some of those ways could be putting in more time. That means learning how to edit your own work or learning how to add audio tracks to your projects. Um, it could even mean adding a few partners to your project. If especially if you're strapped for both time and money, then having another set of hands on board will make life a lot easier if you choose the right hands. So make sure when you're, talking to people that you get someone who is actually reliable and not someone who will be a larger burden than they are a help. Um, and then finally, you want to think about how much passion do you have for this idea? What do you care about your podcast? Why do you care about it? What do you want to do with it? Why are you doing this to yourself? Make sure that you have a reason uh, to do this and to keep doing it even after the newness fades and it's become that thing you have to do every month. Now, people talk about passion a lot, and I feel like it's important to think about it in a lot of different ways because you aren't always going to be on the same level every day. You might care deeply about it, but maybe some days you're sick, you're tired. You just had, the worst day at your other job, and now you have to make your podcast, and you're just sitting there going, oh, why do I have to do this? So, you want to make sure that you at least have a few of these passion check marks going to keep you motivated after you get started. So think about what spells success to you. Is it sharing something you deeply care about with other people? Think back to that target that we developed. How do you feel about sharing things with those people? Do you already hate them? If you do, then maybe this is a poor project choice and you want to go back and like choose a different topic or a different style or something. Because, it's bad to start out already not liking fictional people. Uh, Raising your professional profile. Are you doing this to help your other business improve? Um, are you maybe doing this so you can showcase how great you are at speaking and talking about about your topic? Maybe you're a realtor and you want to showcase how knowledgeable you are about different real estate markets. Well, in that case, this could help you to book more speaking gigs, or it could help you to get a different type of realtor job, whatever it is that you're trying to do. And or maybe it's something that you're doing this podcast to connect with your customers. And if that's the case, then you want to make sure that you also have some other reasons for doing it. Probably if you're talking about connecting with customers, you also want to make sure that you're connecting with them and driving them to your website where hopefully they are buying whatever it is that you're selling or signing up for your email blasts or whatever it is that you're developing on there. Um, and of course, having that first one to sharing something that you care about is always going to be a great like underlying passion level for you. So even when, you're irritated with customers or you aren't getting as many gigs as you hoped for, maybe you can still say, well, look, I'm still raising my professional profile. I am having more people visit my website, and I still feel passionate about this particular topic. Um, One success story I've heard before with as far as using this to promote their website and speaking engagements and stuff, um, was for this ADHD life coach person, and she would develop podcasts, made them, within like 10 minutes, because she knew her audience would probably appreciate it because they probably had shorter attention spans. I know I appreciated it whenever I'd listen to it. And so you would listen, and then even though you would go to her website maybe to read more on the blog post or something, um, you could see that she was using it to improve her connection with her audience. And there probably were a few people who asked her to speak at different gigs or, at conventions and things, or maybe they asked her to go and read part of her book that was coming out, or any of those types of things. So there are lots of different reasons to be passionate about creating a podcast. Um, some other ones, of course, include things like developing community and committed conversation to an issue, and also building an audience to earn ad and sponsor revenue. Like if you're trying to include more people on your Instagram or something, or maybe you're trying to raise awareness about a particular issue, and you feel a podcast is going to be one of the best ways to connect with your target audience. All right. I know that was a lot of information, so let's go over what did we talk about today? In review, we discussed what is a podcast, knowing your purpose and your audience. So, why are you doing a podcast, and who is your audience going to be for this podcast? Different podcast formats, elements of well produced podcasts, your one liner, and the different elements of time, money, and passion in podcast terms. What does that mean production wise? What does that mean for you moving forward? All right. We are finished for today, and I will see you later. Have a great one.